I'm Frank Vaughn. It's April 21st, 2025, and over the weekend I have finished not just reading Mark Carney's book, but studying it so that I could fully comprehend what it was that was being written. A lot of it is just pure Orwellian doublespeak, but we'll get into that. The book called Values, Building a Better World for All is an important study, I think. I wish everybody would read it, but I can also understand after having read it that most people would fall off before they were out of the first part, because it is a dry, statistical, economical look at humanity and solutions for humanity. It talks about imbuing morality and emotions back in the world of finance and central banking. But it comes off as though Mark is exploring concepts when he's talking about emotions and humanity, as though he's talking from the perspective of a fish trying to describe what it is to be a primate, or the vacuum of space trying to describe what it's like to be full and warm. Conceptualizations, foreign concepts, things that he really hasn't experienced and potentially knows nothing about, he is trying to define for all of humanity because he believes in the technocracy. He believes in central banking. He believes in top-down power. The highest form of accountability to this man is to parliamentarians. The people don't really factor in, except as abstract concepts. But anyway, before I get waxing too poetic, I have made a number of highlights, and I think it's really important, considering this man could be the prime minister of our country, for people to understand just what it is he's all about and get an insight into the character and mind behind the person who may be using extreme and massive power, in his own words, to dictate how you live your life in single-minded pursuit of net zero, diversity, and equity. My objective in doing this review is that you understand, before you elect this man prime minister, his basic gestalt and his raison d'etre. We are going to start by looking at some of the key quotes before we go directly to the book for highlights, and I will commentate as I review those highlights. First, I just want to say a tweet I made on April 19th. Mark Carney has been printing money for most of his career. It's all he knows. You can't blame him for wanting to do it as prime minister. He does not view money creation by the central banks in the way that you and I would. People who actually have to work for a living and make things and sell things, these are part of that foreign concept to him. He conceptualizes them. He doesn't understand them. So when he talks about printing hundreds of billions of dollars and handing it to finance, he sees himself doing a public good. He doesn't see it as a public evil. He doesn't see money creation out of thin air as necessarily a bad thing or contrary to the principles of sound money. To him, this is business as normal. This guy's like modern monetary theory anthropomorphized into a human being. So a couple quotes. In particular, the focus was on postponing not a specific death, but a statistical death. Presented with imminent and certain death, most people would value their lives at an exorbitantly high level and thus could not be relied upon for assessments useful to government. This is Carney from Values, page 199. And I wrote, I think this quote is highly revealing of the content of the book. Though ostensibly written about the restoration of morality to the market needed in his eyes, it is so clear that the author is railing against his own fundamental nature. A mind for the numeration of everything alongside a loyalty to total massive centralized state power. To him, the central banks are a force for good. Banking wasn't to blame for the financial crisis of 2008, but the free market itself. And the response to COVID was a complete success. And we're going to see that as we read the quotes, that he looks back on COVID. On the one hand, he talks about the failures of government, but the failures of government in his mind were to not act in a totalitarian way sooner. And he glosses over completely, like so many other subjects. He doesn't talk about the taking away of rights. And ostensibly, even though this book was published in 2021, this is an interesting thing too. There's an insertion, a preface insertion, and then there's an additional chapter insertion that came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Now, I don't know when those insertions came, but has it been a plan for Mark Carney to replace Trudeau for a much longer time frame than we have been led to believe? Because it certainly seems to paint the groundwork. The point that we just need to take away from this is the locking people down, suspending their rights, and forcing them into a medical experience was an appropriate application of government coercion in his mind. In a chapter on the COVID-19 response, Mark Carney writes, obedience to the state was the price of protection. Citizens grant the state a monopoly on violence in exchange for the security it offers. He doesn't argue against it, merely that it must be justified. Now, when he writes this, he's not quoting Hobbes, but he is summarizing Hobbes. But then he goes on to justify the state power that was used during C-19. So he's applying a Hobbesian logic, which is summarized in his summary of what Hobbes stands for, which is obedience to the state was the price of protection, and citizens grant the state a monopoly on violence in exchange for its security it offers. Have you ever voluntarily complied with state violence? When you were born, or at any point in your life, when you came into adulthood, became a man, became a woman, did somebody come along and say, do you voluntarily submit to the Constitution of this federation, the Charter of Rights, and agree to be taxed at source and submit yourself to the law as such? There's no granting of state monopoly. It's taken. Power is taken. I make this point all the time. People point out legalistic issues with the way that Canada is constituted, and my response is always, power is of the day. Power is taken. It is seized. It is fiat, in effect. So I don't think citizens ever get a chance to delegate it to the state. It just is one of those things that happens. The COVID crisis, this is another quote from page 224, the COVID crisis has revealed the importance of the state. And I say it is clear in reading this book that in his mind, massive authoritarian power is the solution to everything, and compliance will be mandatory. I'm not making that up. He talks about social contracts and social acceptability, but in his definition, that extends only to Parliament. It doesn't extend to the people. That certain ideas like net zero require that governments regulate the entirety of the planet. All the affairs of the planet must be regulated around the concept of net zero. He talks about it directly. We'll get into it when we get into the book. Another quote, going forward, we will need almost all new machines like cars to be zero carbon and to scrap any that are not before the end of their useful lives. These are things that are being talked about by Carney being done by 2030 or 2050, respectively. He kind of flips back and forth between those two dates for various reasons. But it is clear the fossil fuel industry is on the chopping block. Another quote, carbon border adjustments, a form of tariff linked to relative climate effort, would allow leading countries to pursue more ambitious targets while avoiding carbon leakage. Now, the reason I include this, and the parentheses are his clarification, they're not mine. In his costed budget that they released just yesterday or the day before, this is a line item, carbon border adjustments. It's a tariff-like structure to penalize countries like the United States for not reducing sufficiently their carbon budgets. This book started being published because, like I said, there's been additions made. I can't get certain about the dates those additions were made. He planned to tariff the United States in the name of net zero since before Trump was even confirmed to be running for re-election. So he supports tariffs implicitly, even though he is willing to destroy Canada in pursuit of a tariff war with the United States. And this is another quote. But governments can delegate certain aspects of the calibration of specific instruments to achieve this target of carbon councils. If you've ever read Lenin, you'll recognize this verbosity, the words, the intellectualization of everything that goes on in this book. Big words, but a lot of Orwellian doublespeak. So contradictory things that I suppose you're supposed to think are, they're like emotives. So you say something like, and this is an actual, I'm paraphrasing right now, but it's an actual quote we'll probably get to. You say something like, we don't want to support employment. We need to support employability. What does that even mean? If you don't have employment, if you don't have jobs, what's the point of employability? But there's all kinds of these double-speak-like terms. And this is symbolized here, but governments can delegate certain responsibility to carbon councils. Now, carbon council, with capitals in the book, two capital C's. These are above and beyond your government, above and beyond Parliament. He advocates for their independence, their privatization even, along with talking in the book about essentially the same thing for ESG, equitability, sustainability, and governance. That he highlights how there's some 60 or 70 different agencies that provide ESG ratings for corporations, and that investors should either invest or deny investment, or governments should regulate that investment can't be made on companies that aren't sufficiently rated by these ESG rating agencies, which are not part of the government but stand apart from it. Again, technocratic institutions dictating what companies can prosper and what companies can't prosper. It's part of his basic philosophy. Many of the problems in society today, from our searing inequalities to our continued destructive dependence on fossil fuels, are the result of misplaced acceptance of the status quo. He hates the internal combustion engine. He hates fossil fuels. He says in this book that the government is going to have to compensate Alberta and the west of Canada because their assets will be left in the ground by the force of the state. So at least he talks about compensation. Doesn't seem to understand that a nation living in the northern hemisphere like Canada does needs gas, needs oil, needs coal, needs energy reserves. Somehow we have to heat ourselves and transport our food around for the 4 to 6 months a year. We can't grow anything and can't survive on our own body heat. These things are just glossed over in the book in favor of an outright assault on fossil fuels in the name of attacking carbon as the principal pollutant threatening Earth. He talks very little. He talks a little bit about species extinction, which is a real thing. He never talks about the deforestation of the Amazon or how to do anything about that, or rampant deforestation to plant soy crops, which is a net negative. He just talks about how to place a value on that deforestation and how the economic system is not very good at placing a financial number on that deforestation. But his principal, primary environmental concern is reduction of carbon dioxide, carbon capture, and re-engineering the whole world against an assault or around an assault on CO2. And it's all premised on CO2 being a primary pollutant. Never once in the book does he mention it being the chief and principal building block of life, that without it, nothing can thrive and exist. He makes it sound like it's a mad panic. If we don't get it under control now, the world is doomed in a decade. But they've been saying that since the 1980s, and the world keeps ticking on. He talks about sea level rise, but the fact is your coastlines are exactly where you left them 100 years ago, because you can see. You can use the evidence of your eyes. You can compare beachfronts. You can compare built-up, developed coastal properties and see that nothing much has really changed. It's all panic, but he accepts the fundamental basis of that panic, that the assault on CO2 is the highest calling of humanity, and governments must respond with overwhelming force to this crisis to re-engineer all of society. Another quote, in this regard, some of the valuation premiums on ESG assets reflect the expectation that their outperformance on ESG factors will ultimately translate into higher profitability in something he calls divine coincidence. This phrase, divine coincidence, is introduced later in the book to fill the gap between the top-down ideology Marx favors, to force the creation of ESG-compliant, inclusive capitalism, which is another term he uses, and how it will magically, profitably succeed. I also highlight his quote from the other day when he released his costed platform, and it would add hundreds of billions in debt to Canada, and he said, I'm an economist, to explain his massive new deficits here in Canada. he doesn't actually have a pathway to profitability. The book is filled with gobbledygook that sounds smart, but relies on virtue, which the book is called Values. But one of the key phrases in the book is values defining value. So whatever's worth money needs to be defined socially and politically ahead of time. So the idea is you re-engineer society, and because you're regulating certain behaviors out of existence, you are forcing the market and finance, and indeed private capital, to invest in the things that you dictate they invest in. And because of that dictation, some fairy magic called divine coincidence will manage to get you a return on your investment. It's thinking like this that explains why ESG is failing all over the world and companies are backing off of it. It is not profitable. But in 2021, things were still moving full steam ahead, and the entire farce of COVID-19 allowed it to expand its foothold for a time. And just to finish up with these quotes that I've shared on Twitter about the carbon councils, these tools include introducing enhanced environmental standards for manufacturing firms or accelerating the phase-out of the internal combustion engine. I think of all the phrases that I read in the book, this one was the most chilling. The phase-out of the internal combustion engine. It is so much more than cars. Your little gas generator, if you live in the countryside, saves you. I just recently, my own family, there was an ice storm in Ontario. They were without power for 18 days because of Bell Canada and their terrible work ethic and practices. It was actually private contractors who eventually restored power to them. Without their internal combustion engine, their life would have been much dirtier, much harder, and much more backwards. The world relies on the internal combustion engine. And he uses the word accelerate here because phasing it out by 2030 or 2050 is not good enough. We need to phase out the entirety of the internal combustion engine as quickly as possible. This is the man promising to save Canada, to build energy resilience, to turn us into an energy powerhouse. How does he plan to do it? He's trying to court Alberta and Saskatchewan and the fossil fuel industry, saying we need to get our products to export markets. But in his book, he's committed to killing them off as quickly as possible, which I've highlighted before and said, which Mark Carney are we to believe? The one that's had a full career in central banking and wrote a book on getting rid of fossil fuels, or the one that's running for an election, which pays lip service to eliminating the carbon tax, which is, it's crazy to me. He's not going to eliminate it. I don't know how anybody can believe this. He might restructure it, but you're still going to end up paying something like $170 per ton. It's coming from somewhere because he wrote a book on how it's essential to the survival of humanity to achieve net zero. The whole book is about net zero. It always comes back to net zero. It's the only theme that is shared across every single part of the book. Getting into the actual book itself, the first thing I want to highlight is just this brief quote because it symbolizes what you find over and over again, the combination of that writing style, Marx's prodigious output, and his frequent revisions of text has spawned a wide range of interpretations of his writings, which, like Smith's, are often mined by commentators for support of their previously held positions. The only philosopher that he frequently comes back to throughout the entire book is Karl Marx, with several shout-outs to Engels as well. He talks about Smith in the opening. He talks about other economists, but I came away with the impression that he views Marx as the top of the heap in terms of economic philosophy. And it makes sense because for Marx, central banking was really important, and for Carney, central banking is everything. There's also a theme in the book of a sense of self-hatred because Mark Carney sits at the top of the heap. He is your principal oligarch. You don't get more oligarchical than running the central banks of two different countries. And he has no problem all throughout the book dropping the names of his fellow oligarchs to mine them for wisdom. He refers to the derogatory term, and we'll probably get to this quote, so you might have to hear it again, of globalism being ascribed to the people of the World Economic Forum. But in his mind, they're humanists. They are the noble technocracy. But at the same time, there's almost a self-hatred. To get a picture of this, he talks about a few years ago, a new record was set for the sale of a painting at public auction when a mystery buyer paid $450 million for a rediscovered Leonardo da Vinci portrait of Christ, Salvator Mundi. How do you value a 15th century canvas so badly damaged that most of the work was painted by the restorer? And why is this depiction of the Savior of the world, who, and it's in quotes, Savior of the world is in quotes, who taught that blessed are the poor, and it's not full quotes, double quotes, it's a single quote, so it's almost mocking the idea, now in the private collection of one of the world's richest people, its value to the world obscured by its scarcity value is maximized. But it's not just this painting. He talks about the 5,500 tons of gold that lie in the Bank of England's vaults, more than 190 million ounces. Think of the futility. He calls the effort of storing gold futility. And he highlights this piece of art. Once, when reflecting on gold's fate, the sculptor Sir Anthony Gormley conceived of bringing that journey to life. He would return both the gold and the observer to their origins by creating a sculpture made from the gold in the vaults, a solitary clay human figure on top of a carpet of gold on which people could walk, sedimenting it into the earth from whence they and the gold came. I suggested to him that the sculpture was unlikely to be seen, given the security requirements. Understanding the true nature of value, he was relaxed. The value was in the creation, in the act, not the witness. This is a central banker, a man responsible for economic policy. And this gives you an indication of his idea of value. There's a self-hatred here. And another quote, today, gold is a relic shorn of its barbs. Gold is at an all-time high. Why is gold at an all-time high? Because people are worried. Faith in fiat currency is in decline. We're in an inflationary period, and people are looking to hedge their bets against inflation. And gold and silver, to a lesser degree, are two of the vehicles they use to try and protect their money. Further to his scorn of gold and silver, he writes, in the free banking era in the United States from 1837 to 1863, numerous private banks issued currencies without any oversight by federal authorities. This was a chaotic period of wildcat banking in which private banknotes of varying reputations circulated at different prices and in different places, making transactions complicated. With supervision largely absent, banks would eventually reduce the amount of gold or silver backing of their notes, debasing their values. There were frequent banking panics and periodic deflations that destroyed livelihoods and disrupted economic activity. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve System was established to oversee the system in 1913 and instituted consistent prudential rules. Consistent prudential rules. And then he moves on to start talking about the UK, completely ignoring, what's that little thing that happened? 1929, the crash, the Roaring Twenties, where the Federal Reserve printed so much fiat currency they tanked the entire economy when the consequences came due. Not to mention the numerous booms and busts since then, including the financial crisis, which he details in the first part of the book of 2008, which, if you go by math, from 1913 to 2008, that's almost 100 years of central banking in the United States. And yet still they managed to have a massive failure. But according to Carney, it's not banking's fault. It's not central banking's fault. It's the free market. It's capitalism. It's the lack of inclusive capitalism that causes these failures. Really interesting whitewashing of history here. He does not mention the crash of 29 until much later in the book, close to the end, and he only mentions it once, and it's not linked at all to central banking. He takes a quick shot at American extraterritoriality, which he says sometimes literally knows no bounds, which is going to be great for relations with the United States. But I just want to highlight something more important. Here's another quote. Modern money is backed by the actions of central banks, not by the gold that lies within them. The tried, trusted, and robust way to maintain confidence in public money is an independent central bank. We're starting to drift into the Orwellian language. To maintain confidence in public money is an independent central bank. So an independent central bank is a private bank managing public money. This means legal safeguards and clear goals together with democratic accountability to ensure broad-based public support and legitimacy. So is it an independent central bank, or is it democratically accountable? Because the Federal Reserve isn't really democratically accountable. No central bank is. They stand above and beyond Parliament. When was the last time you got to vote for a governor of a central bank here in Canada or the United States or anywhere in the world? Was there ever a referendum on the installation of central banking in the first place, or was it imposed? When was the last time you had a ballot initiative that guided the Federal Reserve or guided the Bank of Canada? It's never happened. It stands above and beyond you as a citizen. It is out of your reach and largely out of reach of your elected officials as well. Another quote. I learned early on as governor that a central bank might be effective, but it wasn't sexy. The first spring when I was governor of the Bank of Canada, I began to hear a tour bus every 45 minutes outside my window. The guide would say, "That's the Bank of Canada. They have the world's second biggest gold reserves in there." And I would think, no, we don't. We sold our gold back in the 1990s. After a few days of this, I thought I had better set the record straight in case there was a growing number of Canadians who might inquire about all of the gold that disappeared under my watch. So I asked a colleague to call the tour company to let them know that our money was backed not by gold, but by the, quote, the Bank of Canada's conduct of an independent monetary policy to deliver low, stable, and predictable inflation. I never heard the bus pass by again. No amount of carefully considered technocratic decisions have the allure of gold, even though they are more than worth its weight. He values the decisions of central banks as they govern fiat currency, as they printed hundreds of billions of dollars, which they call liquidity, printing money out of thin air and handing it directly to bankrupt financial institutions, who he also calls solvent. I don't know where that quote is, but he talks about the necessity of the central banks stepping in with hundreds of billions of dollars during the financial crisis that they printed out of thin air, handing them to the failed financial institutions, which he calls solvent. He said they were otherwise solvent. Otherwise solvent meaning that the only thing that was the only problem with those institutions was they didn't have liquidity. What is liquidity but cash? So other than the fact that they had no money, they were solvent. And it blows my mind. So in his mind, these decisions, the central bank is above and beyond the value of gold. That the idea of sound money based on gold is worth nothing compared to the technocratic decision-making of central bankers. This is real. This is in the book. Also, the quote that is underneath it is, this price stability objective is currently defined by the 2% inflation target. Man, did they ever blow that in the last 4 years. I've never done a book review like this before, and the fact is it's really hard to organize because there is so much material in this book to make you doubt your future under a Carney-led government. So remember that 2% inflation target quote that I just read. Here's another quote. Prices in the UK were anything but stable during the 1970s and 1980s. They had a central bank. With the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, UK monetary policy lost its nominal anchor. There followed a series of botched experiments with targets for incomes, monetary aggregates, and the exchange rate. The costs of such failures were enormous, with prices rising by 750% in the 25 years to 1992, more than over the previous 250 years combined. So remember what he said about central banking providing prudential rules and being responsible and being worth more than its weight in gold. While prices and people were getting slaughtered by inflation up to 1992, gold might have been a valuable asset to hold on to. I mean, what do I know? But fiat currency certainly wasn't where you would want to keep your money. Do you think returns on your saving accounts amounted in the UK to 750% to 1992. Another section, removing political considerations from the conduct of monetary policy makes possible a credible commitment to low inflation, but they require strong accountability mechanisms and transparency to legitimize that independence and maintain its public consent. In the 1990s, led by New Zealand and Canada, a number of countries adopted inflation targeting frameworks in independent central banks that embodied these approaches. Yet just in one recent instance, during C-19, the bank underwrote massive money printing and massive spending by the federal government in the name of combating a crisis. So literally, the government walked across the road to the Bank of Canada and demanded hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Bank of Canada just coughed it up. That's how independent they are. That's how depoliticized they are. Yet Mark can write these words. The operational independence of the Bank of England is an example of power flowing from the people via Parliament within carefully circumscribed limits. What are the limits? And again, did the people ever vote to accept central banking into their lives? How can you describe prescribed limits when your ability to print money out of nothing is unlimited and you do it at the request of government? The complete loss of confidence in private finance that occurred in 2008 could be arrested only by public support that totaled $15 trillion in bailouts, government guarantees of bank liabilities, and special central bank liquidity schemes. In the UK, real wages experienced their weakest decade of real growth since Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in the mid-19th century. Trust in the system collapsed. Who underwrote the $15 trillion in bailouts and spending? Who got the $15 trillion? You know, only 47 people, off the top of my head, went to jail in the great financial crisis. Most of them were in the United States. The vast majority of countries around the world didn't jail anybody. And people got wrecked. So the public, via the government, bailed out the banks. They got their bonuses. They all got to skip off scot-free with their profits. But people lost their homes. People lost their savings. And you, the taxpayer, are still paying interest on the burden of the bailouts that you handed out. This is all according to plan, according to Mark. Everything is working perfectly, and he invokes Karl Marx yet again. He doesn't even have to. What does Karl have to do with this except by a time comparison? But he brings him up all the same. Can you see where this is going? How is it that this man has become a hero of the left? His whole book is a celebration of everything that central banking, in the opinion of Main Street, in the opinion of you and me, got wrong. Instead of letting banks fail and letting the cards fall where they may fall, he's perfectly okay with the central bank printing a bunch of money, which raises inflation, handing it over to government, who then underwrites bad banking practices. This, to him, is perfect operation, and for some reason he's a hero? This is the literal oligarchical collectivism that liberals and the left have prided themselves on opposing this entire time. The NDP base, largely because of Jagmeet Singh's personal practices and terrible leadership, but they're leaving the NDP and they're flocking to Carney to stop Polyev. So they're against the career politician in favor of the career oligarch who justifies in his book every action of central banking. It's like the holiest of holies in his mind. Most of what I'm trying to do in this video is to give you an idea into his mindset. If you really want a full picture, you should read the book. It's quite shocking. It's so shocking, in fact, I have a hard time composing this very work. Here's another section. That money is created by private banks, as we saw in Chapter 4, to the extent that people think about it, most naturally don't. They take comfort. He thinks people take comfort from the facts that the banks are regulated by central banks and that any deposits they have in private banks are insured by the state up to a certain limit, currently $85,000 in the UK and over $100,000 in Canada. The system is convenient but relatively expensive, with costs running in between 0.5 and 2% of the transaction value. It's also slow, with payments taking up to 3 days to reach a merchant. Cross-border payments can cost as much as 10 times more, discouraging competition and limiting consumer choice. The core role of money is to facilitate market-based exchange, and private monies spring up when there are areas where that is not happening. Some of these innovations to close gaps in the payment system are good, such as new forms of distributed finance that drive efficiencies in securities, settlement, and innovations that reduce the cost of cross-border payments. Some are bad, such as the use of cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, for ransomware, money laundering, and terrorist financing. In his mind in 2021, the only utility Bitcoin has is for ransomware, money laundering, and terrorist financing. That is total, illegitimate, fake news. Bitcoin is useless for those things nowadays because it's completely traceable. The idea that Bitcoin has anonymity, it doesn't have anonymity. And you can blacklist an address and they can't turn it into cash via an exchange. It's such a small portion of Bitcoin's use is illegality because it is so heavily regulated. But he hates cryptocurrency. And I know there's a lot of people, because I read Reddit. God help me, I read Reddit. People in cryptocurrency that are ultra-liberal, and they're supporting this guy who wants cryptocurrencies gone. There are gaps that we never want filled. These are gaps that we never want filled. We don't want cryptocurrency to fill gaps. We don't want decentralized money or decentralized exchange that is far cheaper than banking and central banking. In Mark Carney's world, you see, it's not just central banks that create money out of thin air. It's your private bank, too, through fractional reserve lending. So it's not just the central banks. It's also private banking that has this amazing ability to print money from nothing. You don't have that ability. You can't create money out of thin air. And when we create systems like cryptocurrencies that enable much cheaper and frictionless exchange, central bankers like Mark Carney view them as an existential threat to their monopoly on money creation. And some of the use cases of money are truly innovative, such as the emerging deployment of distributed ledger technology to track greenhouse gas emissions, green electrons, and carbon offsets, as well as the ability of non-fungible tokens to open up ownership of digital assets. So he gives a nod to NFTs, which have utility in digital gaming and ticket sales and things like that. But the vast majority of the NFT market was used to inflate the value of JPEGs. But it didn't actually inflate the value of JPEGs. It inflated the value of serial numbers loosely associated with those JPEGs. So people who were trading NFTs, these so-called digital images, weren't actually buying and selling the image. They were buying and selling the hash that was associated with the image. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, God bless you. You're probably better for it. Back to the book. Cryptocurrencies advocates claim that a decentralized cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin is more trustworthy than centralized fiat money because its supply is fixed and therefore immune from the age-old temptations of debasement. Its use is free from risky private banks, and those who hold it can remain anonymous and therefore free from the ravenous eyes of tax authorities or law enforcement. In the spirit of dystopian fear and libertarian optimism, the message accompanying the first Genesis block of Bitcoin read, The Times, 3rd January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. So not only is Carney mocking the Genesis block of Bitcoin for calling out rightly that the banks were printing money out of thin air and handing it over to private banks to save them while you, the taxpayer, were on the hook for it, and many people lost their shirts, their homes, and their livelihoods. He also proves in this quote that he doesn't understand anything about Bitcoin, let alone cryptocurrency more broadly, because Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are two different things. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. It is not cryptocurrency. Those who hold it can remain anonymous and therefore free from the ravenous eyes of tax authority and law enforcement. That is, no, you can't. Because converting Bitcoin to Bitcoin is completely traceable. There is no privacy in Bitcoin. The only privacy that you can expect is public-facing privacy. So if you don't link your Bitcoin address to yourself in person, public-facingly, people won't know it's yours. But the exchange you deal with, which converts your Bitcoin to cash, and the bank account that you bring that cash into, and send cash back to the exchange to buy cryptocurrency with. It's all tracked. When you sign up for an exchange, because in this world you still need cash, the biggest chief flaw of cryptocurrency is just about everybody has to convert it to cash before they can do anything useful with it. That exchange has your driver's license, has your name, has your face, it knows your bank accounts, and it knows your wallet address. And it's, your wallet's not really your wallet, it's actually just your keys, which enable you to open parts of the blockchain, but I digress. We call it a wallet. It's not a wallet. It's never been a wallet. It's always kind of bothered me, but whatever. They know your addresses. They know your bank account. They know your identity. There's no anonymity in Bitcoin. And in cryptocurrency, just as an example, there was a developer who developed something called Tornado Cash, which actually would create anonymity when you're using Ethereum. And what did they do? They arrested the developer. So this guy developed software that other people used. That's all he did. And I think he's still in jail. If I'm correct, the Tornado Cash dev is still in jail. I may have that wrong. The only point you need is that he was jailed for developing a piece of software that other people used. He didn't do anything wrong except threaten the system that Mark Carney so loves. There's so much here about cryptocurrency that is just flat out wrong. Like, you're not going to be able to escape tax authorities. You're not going to be able to escape law enforcement for all the reasons that I've already highlighted. But a little bit on, he says, and I didn't even have this highlighted, how well cryptocurrencies fulfill the role of money, and a lot of them don't even claim to be money. But I digress. I mean, smart contracts are a vehicle for making an agreement between two or more parties about how a transaction might be completed, but it's not actually like it's a mechanism for contractual agreement about value transfer. It's not actually money. There's so much more to cryptocurrency than replacing money. Like, I would argue that that's not even its best purpose right now, or its manifested purpose. Anyway, the miners, this is what I take issue with. The miners who create new coins and verify transactions and update the ledger. Yeah, they verify transactions. They update the ledger. But nowadays, mining has gone by the wayside. I mean, Bitcoin still does it, but Bitcoin it might be worth the most. And I'm not here to debate the merits of each individual cryptocurrency, but he talks about it being the supply is fixed and therefore immune from the age-old temptations of debasement. Bitcoin's had 2 inflation bugs. In 2010, they had to roll back the chain because somebody could mint as many Bitcoin as they wanted to, and they did, so they rolled the chain back. And then there was a second inflation bug where the exact same thing could have happened, but it was disclosed in a responsible way by a Bitcoin Cash developer. Who knows what other flaws might be lying at the heart of Bitcoin, because it is spaghetti code. Whether it's worth the most or not, there's a socially constructed agreement that Bitcoin has, as the first mover, has the most utility. But mining, the energy-intensive mining of Bitcoin, is outmoded next to proof of stake and other superior systems of verification of ledger entries. But I digress. I don't want to get into that. It's just that he says that they create the new coins. Miners don't create anything. They verify transactions, and the code pays them for that service in the currency itself. They're not creating anything. The code creates the thing. They're just interacting with the code. They're just running the code themselves. The other thing, the wallet providers who offer custodian services. Nope. First off, it's not a wallet. It just stores your keys. You possess it. I guess there are certain third-party wallet providers, or if you're talking about custodian services, I guess that's what Coinbase does, or Newton here in Canada, or Bitmart, or any of these other exchanges. I guess they provide custodian services, but when you have a wallet that's your wallet, the custody is yours. It's self-custody. The whole idea of cryptocurrency is that you take possession of the thing, your asset, yourself, and you have no middlemen. He doesn't even understand what he's talking about, but he is deeply threatened by it. Just to put a bow on that, the idea of cryptocurrency at its core is self-custody, not custodian services. So when I say that Coinbase does custodian services, I mean for the people who are just buying ticker symbols without really, they're just speculating for gains, and they leave all of their coins, which aren't really even coins, on Coinbase. They're not doing cryptocurrency right in the first place. They're trusting an exchange, and so you expose yourself to counterparty risk in scenarios like Mt. Gox and a million other scams that happen every single year if you don't take possession yourself. So if you're playing the cryptocurrency game, get yourself a wallet. Know your keys, not your coins. Anyway, further to this, he writes, finally, cryptocurrency, when used as money, raise a host of issues around consumer and investor protection, market integrity, money laundering, terrorism financing, tax evasion, and the circumvention of capital controls and international sanctions. To the extent that they are used for transactions rather than speculation, many cryptocurrencies seem more attractive to those active in the black or illegal economy. This adds to their trust deficit and means that once they are brought into the regulatory net, as all forms of money eventually are, their attractiveness as money will diminish. His argument is that they're useless. But what they do is they decentralize, or they try to decentralize the preservation of value or wealth or transaction away from the banking system, which is very inefficient and incredibly unfair. This idea of money laundering and market integrity and terrorism financing, these are the old monsters that central bankers raise. The vast majority of cryptocurrency transactions are speculative. Nobody is doing what they claim they're going to do. You don't have to. I showed in another video on this channel that if you want to order cocaine, MDMA, PCP, marijuana, mushrooms, acid, whatever you want, you just go to a website. You pay with your credit card. It's mailed securely to your door via Canada Post. You don't need cryptocurrencies in Canada because we're already a wide open criminal market. So none of this has any validity whatsoever. And by the way, Diem is gone. Formerly known as Libra, it was sold to Silvergate, and they shut the whole thing down because of regulatory hurdles that guys like Mark Carney put in their face. It just wasn't worth it for Facebook to develop it. So he talks about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and specifically names Diem. These are the only things that are specifically named in the book outside of central bank digital currencies. Diem doesn't exist, and he was worried about it sucking up all the world's money. It is likely that the best structure for a CBDC, central bank digital currency, would be a two-tiered system where consumers have an indirect claim on the CBDC via an intermediary, which can be a bank or a digital wallet such as Apple Pay or Facebook's Calibra. The reason the central banks like central bank digital currency is it would remove speculation from the equation because they would have absolute control, and only, as you might note, the technocrats-approved companies and global corporations would have the ability as middlemen between you and the digital currency. They would have all the control. And that's really what it's all about. And here's just another quote, because you can't resist taking more pot shots. From the early clipping of coins to the Bank of Amsterdam to Bitcoin, time and again, the temptations to cheat and debase have proven too great. So again, he's ascribing to Bitcoin characteristics that don't exist in Bitcoin, while also glossing over what is really the problem, and that is the threat that decentralized currencies pose to the central banking system. This video has already gone on quite long, and to be completely honest with you all, I don't know how much utility it is. I mean, I've read his book. I am completely confident in my assessment that you will never have a more globalist-aligned, technocratic, World Economic Forum, Davos guy who has no problem printing trillions of dollars to chase his net zero pipe dream. But we're already at almost an hour, and I haven't even drilled into the net zero aspect of this book and how he wants it to infect and affect every single aspect of your life. Every investment decision, every personal decision, every single activity of life must be funneled through litmus tests designed by guys like Mark Carney and these technocrats, designed by them, before that behavior is approved. And every single behavior will have a cost, a relevant cost. Is this video worth a part 2? Let me know in the comments if you think it's worth a part 2, and I'll just keep going through these highlights until they're done. But let me know if this one was useful, if you liked it. I'm kind of missing doing the regular content, but I feel, in light of the fact that this is election week and we're going to have a new government in 7 days, that it might be worth examining exactly what it is Mark Carney stands for. I'm Frank Vaughn. I'll see you in the next one. Did you know that I have a website, frankvaughn.ca, the ultimate repository for all of my work, and a backup location just in case the censors come for me again? And if you like the content, please consider using the donate link in one of the options available. There are no paywalls, there is no advertising, and there is no Patreon, and I intend to keep it that way. Thank you for your time and your consideration.